This is the Living History Podcast, broadcasting live across the airwaves.
Hello everyone, welcome to Living History, and I'd like to also welcome a very special guest we have with us today. We've been talking about our World War II cruise we have coming up, and one of the historians who's coming on that cruise is joining me today. It's Keiko Tamura. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
This cruise that we're doing in August next year, it's going to be, I think, a really wonderful experience, and the highlight of the cruise will be the conference program we have during the Sea Days. And I think a lot of people are looking forward to your contribution to that conference because of your perspective on the Japanese aspect of the Second World War. Why don't we start? Can you take us back a little bit and tell us, how did you even end up in Australia? And tell us about the work that you've done since you've been in Australia.
Yeah, well, it's a long story because I've been here for quite a long time. I came here with 1 year scholarship. I didn't know anything about Australia. It's just that scholarship kind of organizers, Rotary Club, wanted me to come to Australia. And then I did degrees in anthropology at the Australian National University. And my PhD topic was on Japanese war brides. So Japanese women who married Australian soldiers in occupied Japan. And so my interest was mainly post-war Australia, Japan, and Australia-Japan relations. But during that time, towards the end of my PhD, Australia-Japan research project started at the War Memorial. This project was Japanese government-funded project to kind of mark the 50th anniversary of the end of the Pacific War. And that's the beginning of my involvement in the military history side of Australian history.
Why do you think it's important that we in Australia make the effort to have an understanding of the Japanese perspective? Because I think in Australia we suffer, like many nations do, from focusing only on our own story. And particularly when it comes to the Second World War, we can tell the story of Kokoda or Milne Bay or the Battle of the Coral Sea. We can tell any of these chapters, but we tend to do it only from our own perspective. Why is it important that we understand the Japanese story as well?
Well, war is between two nations and two peoples. And then again, it becomes quite individual experiences. And of course, it's, in a sense, much easier to tell a story from one side with the bravery, courage, and other aspect. But in order to understand the more human side of the war, it's not just the victory and defeat, suffering, and then a sense of, in Australian sense of mateship and other things. I think it's very important to know why the other side won't get into the war, what they were thinking about when they were fighting, and what kind of experiences they had. And I think by doing that, it's not just a military history from one side, but I think it becomes much wider human experience relating to this kind of huge turmoil, which happened in somewhere outside, say, Australia and outside Japan. And so it becomes more, I think, first of all, I think interesting, but also meaningful for lots of people.
Do you think, from an Australian perspective, our perception of the Japanese soldier, the Japanese people during the Second World War, do you think we have an accurate understanding of Japan and the Japanese people during the Second World War?
It's difficult to say whether that's accurate or not, but I can certainly say that Australian public and the military historians are putting quite a lot of effort to understand Japanese perspective. But then there is a language barrier to start with, and also military culture, Japanese military culture during the Pacific War is quite peculiar. It's not the norm for Japanese culture. I think during that period, it's a very, in many ways, anomalies or abnormal kind of sense of nation and world and other things. So it's not that easy, even for Japanese, contemporary Japanese, to understand what the Japanese soldiers and also Japanese public were thinking during that time. So, yeah, it's a very complicated story.
Well, part of your role on the cruise will be to hopefully help us understand that story a little bit better. But as you said in our discussions, in the conversations I've had with you about it, the personal stories are what motivate you to learn more and what you know a lot about. Is that the aspect of the cruise that you're looking forward to shedding light on, the personal stories, the human involvement in the Second World War?
Yes, that's the area that I've been always interested in. And then not just the soldiers' experiences, but I'm also interested in, say, military nurses' experience. Japanese and Australian military nurses were also involved in the Pacific War. And then also I've been interested in local islanders' experiences. And those are it's very difficult to generalize their experience. So what I can maybe introduce is some of the personal stories. And then the people who learn those stories might be able to kind of picture the time and the location and circumstances. And I hope those information will be kind of, first of all, interesting. And also, I hope that will become very useful to kind of understand what was happening then and what people were thinking, what people were doing.
I'm sure it will be very warmly received by the people in our group. And you mentioned there the story of the local people. It seems to me that we, as Australians, we know a lot about the Australian story. We know much, much less about the Japanese story, but we know virtually nothing about what happened to the local people. And I spend a lot of time in New Guinea, a lot of time in the Solomon Islands. There's a very strong cultural story, a very strong cultural history, a very human element to what the people who were there were suffering through during this fighting. And this was on their homeland. We talk about New Guinea or the Solomon Islands as some remote place, like it was just some uninhabited area. It wasn't at all. There were so many local people so heavily involved. So I think it's really wonderful that the work you've done to tell their stories as well.
I hope I will be able to make some contribution towards the discussion and also at the conference as well.
Also, it's not just about the conference, we're visiting a couple of very key battle sites. And I know you're not specifically a military historian, but have you been up to these sites before, to Milne Bay and Rabaul? Are you looking forward to actually walking this ground where this history unfolded?
Well, particularly at Rabaul, because as people might know, there were 100,000 Japanese at the end of the war in Rabaul. And then I also worked with the military nurses who were working in the Rabaul, Japanese Naval Hospital in Rabaul. So I read a lot about Rabaul, and I'm really looking forward to visit there.
It's the story of Rabaul could be we could run a whole tour in its own right just going to Rabaul, because there was the story of Australia's first action of the First World War, and then in the Second World War, the Japanese arriving and fighting with the Australians in 1942, and then this long period of occupation and this growing to become the most important base in the Southwest Pacific for the Japanese. And then, of course, a base that there was never any fighting there to capture it. They simply bypassed it. So I think Rabaul is one of those really interesting little smaller chapters, one of the sub-chapters of this much longer story about the Second World War.
Yeah, definitely. There were both Japanese Army and Japanese Navy stationed in Rabaul. And Rabaul was one of the very rare cases that Navy and Army worked together, because they were isolated and they had to work together. And not only that, there were Catholic nuns, Australian Catholic nuns, interned, I think, in Rabaul, south of Rabaul. So there were lots of, as you said, stories in that area that we can kind of tease out.
I'm probably going to be touching on areas here that you're going to speak more about on the cruise itself, but I'm interested just in one aspect of this Japanese experience. How do modern Japanese people, how do they relate to that? How do they rationalize this period of history which was so violent, and the behavior of the Japanese in many instances was terrible? In many ways, the German people have had to do the same thing. How, as a modern Japanese person, do you come to terms with this very dark chapter of your history that was only 7 decades ago?
That's a very difficult question. And as issue, I think, as you might have heard of, Japanese textbook issues been going on for quite a long time. The Japanese students in, say, junior high school, senior high school, they don't have much chance to learn, particularly about the pre-Pacific War, Pacific War, and post-Pacific War period. So one problem is that people don't know much about it. So since they don't have much information, they don't know much, it's very difficult to come to terms with it. So when, say, Japanese young university students or high school students come to visit Australia, and they come to visit the Australian War Memorial in the Pacific War Gallery or the World War II Gallery, and I gave tour to some of those groups, and they often say, I didn't know anything about those things, because particularly in Japan, the Pacific War is regarded as a war between Japan and the United States. So people don't know much about the war in New Guinea and war against Australia. So one most important thing in Japan is that young people, but also older people too, should learn more about the war to start with. And then how they can come to terms with it. Whether it's, you conclude that it was just a strange period that fascism kind of controlled everybody, or do Japanese have that tendency of kind of grouping together and then follow the leader, even though the leader might be very kind of, fascist, kind of tendency. That's something Japanese also have to think about. But I think Japanese in general are still coming to terms with it. It's a ongoing process, even after 70 odd years. Yeah.
They talk in Germany about the idea of collective guilt. That there's always a constant debate in Germany as to whether the nation of Germany should bear responsibility, or whether it was simply a group of people that were there at the time. Japan must have that same struggle to come to terms with that. What's your opinion about that? Does Japan as a nation bear responsibility for the actions of individuals during the war? Or do you think it's better to consign that to history and look to the future?
That's a very complex question. I think comparing with Germany, Japanese case, the war ended with Hiroshima and Nagasaki with 2 atomic bombs, and also similar to Germany, large-scale air raids. So for a long time, Japanese memory of the war was this victimhood. So there was suffering, but ordinary people suffered. People who didn't have any fault suffered. But then in the last, say, 20 years, I think Japan as an aggressor, particularly in Asia, that became quite accepted. And then that's related to issues like comfort women's issues, and also forced labor of Korean people, and that's still at the moment. This is 2019 contemporary issues, a big kind of controversial issue between Japan and Korea at the moment. So nation responsibility certainly is huge, but I think individual have to acknowledge the responsibility of people who were led by those leaders. Yeah. But it's a very difficult thing for Japanese to accept that ordinary people had the responsibility. Since for the last, say, 50 years, Japanese kind of general sentiment was the military was the one who was responsible. We were guiltless, So kind of there was a very kind of basic level shift of thinking that Japanese people have to accept and also make, and it takes time.
Well, Keiko, your ideas about this and your input into this topic are going to be absolutely wonderful, and I think one of the most interesting aspects of the cruise. And it's the thing that I think is going to be so great about the cruise is this is not just one presentation at a conference. This is a solid 10 days where we have the opportunity to explore these things over many days with the passengers on the tour. So I'd say to everyone listening, I hope you've enjoyed just this brief conversation we've had with Keiko, and the opportunity to do it for a lengthy version of that on the cruise is going to be really wonderful. So the cruise is in August 2020. We'd love everyone to join us. And Keiko, just thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you very much, Matt.